Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler. I'm the host of this podcast. I call it these days Seeing Things Whole. I originally started calling it A Man on a Mission. Other things are A Better Human Story. And my firstborn son suggested it be called Let's Be the Heroes We Need. All of those fit. Uh, I talk about a variety of different things, but they're all part of seeing things whole and they all fit together. Um, he, Today I'm going to start with those first two pieces. The forest is coming and the mind of the bread baker are what I mean when I give this today's podcast the title, Two Moments That Impacted Me at a Spiritual Level. Um, I, uh, but then we're going to go into other realms as well, having to do with the rather difficult and ugly situation we find ourselves in this country and in this moment of history. Um, that I kind of prefer the sort of the wonderful spiritual experiences, but one of the spiritual experiences of these times for me has got to do with fear. Um, I am fearful that some things that are really, I will say, sacred are in danger right now, and the fear makes it harder for me to have the level of spiritual experience that I believe is the human ideal. Somehow, um, as cultures have shown across the world and throughout history, uh, the spiritual understanding is what people think is basically where it's at. That's why, uh, the religion uh, of various kinds in Asia and Europe and various anthropological societies, studied societies, people are always creating a picture of the world um, that gets them to where it's really at, and they build that into a very important part of the foundation of how they organize human life. So that Shinto Japan is not like Catholic Italy. Um, anyway, I think that that's an important lesson. There is a level of where it's at that is part of being alive, being fully alive, but at the same time, keeping oneself open to that level means also keeping oneself open to some of the pain when you're in a world that is broken in some fundamental ways. So uh, this what our fallen soldiers died for is a piece I wrote around Memorial Day of this year, and which has been published in the Shenandoah Valley, the 6th Congressional District of Virginia, where I was a Democratic candidate for Congress. It's sort of a message out there because I think that there are a lot of patriots where I live who are embracing the opposite of what our soldiers died for, say, in World War II, and what we generally have recognized that America is sort of representing when it goes to war, sometimes with some hypocrisy, but sometimes with some validity. Well, you can see what the other topics are. Let me get to the forest is coming. Uh, there are, I talked with Forrest, the last podcast I did here. We talked about a secular path um, into the what was it? Into the spiritual dimension, where I argue that if we look at the evolutionary perspective, we can see that there is a dimension of experience that we have is part of our innate human capabilities, And the fact that it's been selected for to be part of our nature, part of the human genome, tells us something really important about the importance that this is something that's life-serving, that it helped our ancestors choose the right path to survive into the future with their DNA, which is what we are. We're their heirs. And we're the heirs specifically of the people who got the stuff that anyway, we talked about that. And it's something of a struggle to understand exactly what do you mean by the spiritual dimension. Because our secular culture doesn't have much of a concept of, let me go back to where I can see how the hell I look. Yeah, I should have done this first. Sorry. Imperfect engineering. The secular culture doesn't have a way of really conceptualizing the spiritual dimension. It tends to be somewhat dismissive. And that's part of our problem right now. For example, in America, why the side that needed to represent the good was sort of checked out in terms of deep contact with the moral dimension and the spiritual dimension. But that's another story. But also in the religious traditions, as opposed to the secular worldview, the idea of the spiritual has been given such a defined role, a role that fits into the religious system. Not the same like in Zen Buddhism as in Christianity, but each one has its. I think they're both right, and I think the point is that when it comes to what experiences are we talking about that touch upon the spiritual dimension, there are a lot of different routes to it. Holding your newborn baby in your hands could be one of them. In my case, my life is sort of hinged on a variety of moments that were. One changed the whole course of my life. That book back there, The Parable of the Tribes. Should I bother to bring that up? Yeah, I think I will try. The Parable of the Tribes, which was the product of a sort of a life-changing moment when I was 24, where I saw something which was of importance, this great spiritual importance as I experienced it then, but being brought up to be a thinker, my articulation of what I had seen was in the form of a compelling argument by a well-trained social scientist that says something important and ill-attended to in our culture about what it means to be a civilization-creating creature, and how it inevitably generates a force that drives things in a destructive way that are not a function of the creature. I mean, it was a big deal, and it's still a big deal. I've been mining that thing, and I got no doubt but that I'm on to something big. I'm not sure exactly how big. And one of the topics today, how much does human needs dictate the course of how civilization develops? You know, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I identified a force there that really plugs into. I experienced the idea of the sacred in that moment, even as I was sort of seeing that to step onto the path of civilization has some inevitable implications that nobody seemed to have been talking about, and that put things in an importantly different light. I mean, that was life changing, and I've my whole life I continue to mine that idea that shows that we have a different, better nature than we have been taught that we have, and that we believe that we have. I've got a way of looking at human history, which I think is valid, that puts the ugliness that we see in it in a very different light that doesn't reflect on us the way we have assumed. And it puts into perspective what are the challenges we face. It identifies that if you're going to step onto the path of civilization, and we're the only species out of however many millions of species there have been on this planet that's done this thing of removing ourselves from the niche in which we evolved biologically by inventing our own way of life. If we're going to do that, and any place, any other creature may have done that, it unleashes a dynamic which is going to require that the force be brought under control, or the species is going to end up destroying itself. And we're right now in a sort of the cockpit of that question. I mean, we've developed the means to destroy ourselves, and we have not yet put our house in order. The house that was inevitably going to be disordered, because when you get out of the natural order, you plunge into a disorder. That's what's that idea. But I've got a couple of other things that are just a lot more simple, and I wrote pieces that articulated a moment that was sort of a wow moment. In the case of The Forest is Coming, which I'm about to read to you. And a sort of, oh my God, so that's how it works moment in the mind of the bread baker. Now, I don't know if that was the right articulation, oh my God. But you'll see. I mean, I saw something, and that, for me, that's often the route into getting to that where it's that kind of level of experience. I would like to be more capable in a lot of heart kinds of opening. I went to a wedding where I could see that there were people there who had a great capacity to get to the where it's at spiritual level of experience through the heart. And it's not like I'm a complete shutout on that, but my strong suit is that I can see things, and sometimes seeing, depending on what you see and how you see it, and the depth of the seeing, it can be a spiritually impactful experience. So here's the piece called "The Forest is Coming." I've been remembering a special moment back near the end of my first decade of living on the side of a forest-covered mountain on the western flank of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley back in the 1990s. It was as I sat on a somewhat flat area of my roof that I saw it. Looking out across our valley, though I was alone, I gave out an inaudible and involuntary wow. Our place sits just below the top of a ridge, looking west across a trough of forested land leading up to the next ridge, which is high enough to be called Great North Mountain, though it runs mostly north and south. The land on the mountain is national forest, and sometime in the recent past, patches of those woods had been harvested for lumber. Though farming is almost wholly gone from ridgeland like ours, while farms do persist in those broader and more fertile valleys that made this area the breadbasket of the Confederacy, on our side of this forested trough, you can find old evidence of homesteads and overgrown fields where people tried to grow a living off these steep and vulnerable slopes. Like the rest of the great eastern woodlands of America, the virgin forests that once covered these mountains lost their virginity long ago to humans bearing axes. Photos from the mid-19th century in Virginia and elsewhere often show treeless landscapes, vivid evidence of how people then thought of forests as something in the way, something to be eradicated. The imprint of humanity on these woods has also been made less directly. A century ago, magnificent American chestnuts were a major component of these forests, but they were struck down by a fungus inadvertently introduced to North America by people who wanting to add the Chinese chestnut to their landscaping. I'm a little confused as to whether it's a Chinese chestnut or the Japanese. But anyway, it got imported. It was carrying a fungus, and it eradicated the magnificent chestnut forests that were native to this area. And then there's the gypsy moth, an alien species accidentally let loose in New England generations ago. Perhaps it was the gypsy moths, which were plentiful and voracious here the first couple of years after we moved here, that helped obscure the reality I now saw, the one that made me feel like, wow. Then also, that spring, starting cold, was slow in coming. But when it warmed, the sudden new burst of green came rising up strongly out of the earth and through the wood. And as I sat on my roof watching the trees coming into leaf, I discovered the secret that they contained. The forest is coming. That's what I said to myself after that initial wow. What was visible to me was that something powerful was emerging from the earth. Not just emerging during that burgeoning spring, but gathering strength and gaining ground over the years since we'd moved here. It was as if my mind were now able to play out a years-long time-elapse film and could discern in that mental reel what it is that the earth is up to. What the earth wants to create here is a great forest. And laid out before me was the evidence of how substantially the earth had progressed in this vital endeavor. The previously bare patches on Great North Mountain, as my time-elapsed memory movie now revealed, were being nibbled away by the spreading green of trees, as what recently had been shrub-sized dots had swelled into identifiable trees rising skyward. And the tops of the rows of trees that grow a couple 100 feet downhill from us, just below our clearing, now stretched up a good 6 or 8 feet above where they'd been last time I'd noticed. In the flush of the spring, I could feel the forest growing towards us, rising around us. What a beautiful and mighty living thing I saw, reclaiming its domain. This is what happens on this part of our earth, I said to myself, when we get out of the way. I think that that sentence, what a beautiful and mighty living thing I saw, reclaiming its domain, is maybe points the most directly to what felt spiritually moving to me about that. I mean, I think that we're all the time ensconced in profound dramas of many kinds. But we don't tend to see it, or if we see it in a shallower way than sometimes when we see it in a bigger and deeper way. And when I saw that the earth wanted to create a forest here, that somehow this was the way life on earth wanted to manifest itself. And that plugged into some other spiritual aspects of my own path that had arisen even along with the same thing as the parable of the tribes, a sense of that civilization has unleashed some destructive stuff, and that there's something sacred in the wholeness of what life on Earth created before we unleashed civilization onto this planet with all the problematic consequences. I've had spiritually meaningful moments around the giant trees, like Muir Woods above San Francisco in Marin County. The sense of the power uh, of these trees as sort of an embodiment of the sacred. This is a spot of wholeness. Uh, it occurs to me that FDR staged an important part of creating the United Nations in Muir Woods not long before he died, I think 1945. The United Nations was a big deal to FDR in terms of what there should be after this World War II. So it feels fitting. I mean, in principle, the United Nations attempts to be a step in the direction of the kind of wholeness that we're probably going to need at some future point, because eventually, if without it, we're going to destroy ourselves in a nuclear holocaust, if nothing else. I mean, of course, it's failed because it was set up, in a sense, in a way that was bound to be only minimally successful when all the great powers are given veto power over anything that actually could do anything. It says that only the secondary powers are even conceivably under the domain of an international order where certain UN principles are supposed to be observed. If Putin wants to attack Ukraine or the United States wants to attack Iraq, well, we're not out of the disorder that led to World War II and that FDR. But he took it to, he wanted the wholeness that could be created at that point in 1945 with this set of powers, with Churchill's UK and FDR's United States, and etc. What could be created to move the world that keeps on trying to destroy itself in world wars, as one could see in 1945, to take a step toward wholeness. Well, it's a great place when you're seeing what nature creates in the form of Muir Woods. I have had a similar experience also among the Sequoia National Park, a different giant tree inland, not the misty forests, but the dry mountains of central California, two national parks worthy of it, Kings Canyon and Sequoia National Park, and these trees that are just such magnificent creatures. That fill one with a sort of sense of awe. Look, and Olympia National Park up in, on that peninsula across the Puget Sound from Seattle. There are Douglas firs there that are virgin forest and that are so giant that it would take 30 people arm in arm or something like that to me, though that is a factual reality, it is imbued with us with a spiritual impact for me to behold it. Not sure what I'm able to claim about the reality, but I think that the sacred is something that we experience, and we can experience it in a whole lot of different ways. And for me, that moment back in the 90s when I sat on my roof and saw, my God, the forest is coming. A sense of there being a power in life that is not just the will of human civilization. I don't know what more to say about that piece. But it's a special piece to me because it was a special experience that I had that led to it. It's the kind of experience that, if I were the person I wanted to be, uh, I would regularly have experiences like that and be able to articulate some impactful moment that took me to some kind of where it's at realization. All right, this is a little different. It was, I would say that it was fundamentally, it grew out of an insight, but it was an insight that felt like it laid bare some profound dimension of how the human world and human consciousness work. It's a particular instance of the shaping of the human mind and the consequence of that shaping that kind of blew me away. So I'm hoping that this will have some kind of meaningful impact for you. That's what I try to do when I write something, is to articulate it in a way that takes the reader along. I mean, well, that's what a novelist does, or shorts, or a poet. How do you write something that leads the reader to have the meaningful thing that you're trying to deliver? And I'm not going to make any claims for this, except that it was the best that I could do, and that it was gratifying to me to compose it, which makes me confident that I didn't completely miss when I swung. It was published in the Christian Science Monitor in June of 1996, and I was so gratified with the way that I mean, as an author, I've got a lot of frustrations, some gratifications, but one of the gratifications was the job the Christian Science Monitor did on this piece. They gave it a whole page with a nice title. Well, it wasn't the title that I had composed. I call it The Mind of the Bread Baker. And they changed it, and I had mixed feelings about this, to The Mind of the Bread Baker and the Seeds of Empire. I still don't know quite how I feel about it, but I know that newspaper editors think that they have the right, and therefore they do have the right. They're the ones with the paper and the ink to do what they want with the title. Now, sometimes I have, struggled successfully to let the editor, for the editor to let me have my titles. But anyway, but the thing that made me especially gratified is that they created a really nice illustration which showed a loaf of bread sitting on a blue napkin, big napkin, or cloth, or something between a napkin and a tablecloth, with a bread slicing knife lying and well composed. So this was a moment that I felt great fulfillment, because they had treated it so nicely. And when I got my copy in the mail, I had it framed, and it's hanging in the room where April and I have couples sleep when there are guests overnight. I don't know if people read it or not. Sometimes people will say something, but I don't have a picture of me with the President of the United States. That's not the life I've led. But the Christian Science Monitor published this, and this was what I said. From the time my little son was 8 months old, he and I have done the grocery shopping together. When Nathaniel was a toddler, discovering at every turn what the world was about, I used to joke that I took him to the supermarket because I wanted him to know where food really comes from. It's not just something that's there when you open the refrigerator, I'd say. You've got to go to the source, someplace like Safeway, where it sits on the shelves. He shouldn't take getting our daily bread for granted, I declare solemnly. I hope that one can hear the irony and the joke in that. But anyway, I assumed that people would. Back then, we lived inside the Washington Beltway. But before our boy was 4, we left. I had found that my spirit was withering from living in a landscape where earth was just an occasional break from the pavement, just something allowed to exist in the interstices of the human grid. After a decade in a realm where the human element tyrannizes over everything, I yearned to have a place where the land around me was shaped less by my own kind than by the hand of living nature. Well, you can see that that dimension of my spirituality that was in the forest is coming repeated here. Yeah, I forgot that emphasis was in here. We moved out to the mountains of Virginia, and Nathaniel worked with me as we carved out some terraces on the hillside to grow our own herbs and vegetables. We carried chicken manure and horse manure down the slope to enrich the soil. We planted our seeds. We carefully monitored the moisture levels in the earth to make sure our plants had what they needed to thrive. And we kept some seeds from one year's harvest to plant the next. The idea of his knowing where our food came from was no longer just a joke. And my spirit revived, rising back upright like some limp plant that just needed watering. I felt connected with the generations before me who lived from the yield of the earth, connected with my roots in this amazing experiment of life on this special planet. Then I took up the baking of bread. Why not? As a writer, I work at home and can easily take a few minutes to tend to its various phases. And is there anything that tastes better than bread fresh from the oven? During the years I've been baking bread, it has gradually dawned on me what a marvelous invention this stuff is. We think of it as the staff of life, something quite basic, but really, our ancestors lived on this earth for countless thousands of years before anyone even thought of bread. You've got to gather the grain, you've got to grind it, you've got to get it moist, and then there's the miracle of the leavening process. What kind of genius was it, I started to wonder, who first understood this whole process well enough to produce reliably the wonderful food of risen bread? No doubt, the yeast first entered the dough by accident, landing invisibly from the breeze, feeding on the moistened grain the way that molds will make an open tomato furry with their growing filaments if you leave that tomato sitting on a summer countertop. And by the way, I know that, well, they say that bread originated about 5,000 years ago in the Nile Valley. And they believe that that's how the yeast first got to bread. It was by accident. Not long ago, as I mixed my dough, I understood. I had asked here, what kind of mind did it take? And I'd mentioned before, who first understood this process well enough to reliably produce it? Not long ago, as I mixed my dough, I understood. Here's the moment of realization. The minds of those who conceive this process of turning grain into bread had themselves been cultivated by generations of experience, turning earth into crops of food to eat. What I saw was this. The baker of bread is farming, and what he is growing is yeast. Think of it. The farmer tills his or her soil. The baker grinds the wheat into flour, preparing a special kind of earth for a particular kind of crop. The farmer sows seed into his prepared soil. The baker adds yeast into the dough. Like the step from primitive societies' gathering of seeds for eating into agricultural societies' growing of crops, the step into the baking of leavened bread also required people to grab hold of the forces of growth and reproduction. The seed that used to just fall onto the ground is now planted, whether it's the crops or the seeds we call yeast. The seed that used to just fall onto the ground is now planted. The fungus that used to biodegrade the seed grain in the earth is now brought to the feast of the seed, ground up for the dough. Yeast feeding on the grain. Like the irrigator of crops, the grower of yeast must make sure there is enough moisture in the soil that's been prepared. It's not just coincidence that leavened bread was invented about 5,000 years ago. This here is in the piece. About 5,000 years ago by farming people living in the Nile River. Living by the Nile River, yeah. A desert area where irrigation and control of water were vital to survival. The farmer needs warmth and sunlight for his crops to thrive. The baker puts his or her leavened dough in the warm sunlight or by the warm stones of an oven to rise. The farmer must be patient with the organic processes of growth, waiting for the crops to mature before attempting to harvest. The baker must also bide his time, waiting at each stage for the dough to rise. And when I bake bread, I set my timer for like 45 minutes or 40 minutes. And every time the timer goes up, I go and I don't get my hands into this stuff. I'm a little squeamish about things like that. But I got a big spoon and I beat the thing up until I get bored with it. And then I go back and set the timer again for 45 minutes. And the farmer has to be patient, and so does a baker. If in his vision of the world, the baker of bread is a farmer, that also means that the baker is an engineer, engineering the growth of living stuff. The baker is one not only with the sower who drops seeds into furrows, but also with the herder who brought wild animals into a pen. We take all this for granted, but this breakthrough of mind brought about a revolution in life on earth. That's what that book is about, The Parable of the Tribes. This is a fundamental point of discontinuity. And that the human beings who took this unprecedented step of becoming farmers were shaping their consciousness. And that all those parallels sort of suggest how, if you want to understand human consciousness, you got to understand the way the culture is shaping it. I doubt that a hunter-gatherer would be particularly inclined to perceive the ability to farm yeast in the mixed up, moistened dough. But if you've got generations of people doing that with the earth and seeing, this is like a Japanese garden is to a genuine full landscape. The bread baking process is this miniaturization of what the farmer has been doing for, by 5,000 years ago. Farming, planting seeds was probably 5,000 years ago. Full out agriculture and irrigation came later, but the beginnings of gardening and of herding and things like that. The human empire was taking off because of that unprecedented step. There's just so much that, and this is the the whole piece revolves around a moment that, of, it wasn't wow like with the forest, it was like, wow, this is how human consciousness can work, that our cultures shape us in certain kinds of ways. And we don't necessarily see things altogether in all the ways it should be seen, but we get enculturated to see it in particular ways. Anyway, it kind of it gave me gooseflesh when I realized that what I was doing, that I was acting like a farmer, and I was growing yeast. When I saw that, and I saw that when you look back at the beginnings of bread, the staff of life, something you find in just about every kind of restaurant you go to, they got some kind of bread, Afghani bread or Polish bread or French bread. Uh, there's just all kinds of ways in which human cultures have put bread at the center of their survival, and that they were able to do it, at least in part, I'm suggesting in this piece. They were able to do it because their minds had been trained by generations of doing pretty much what bread baking requires. Okay, let me finish the piece up. I think about this revolution. I just talked about a revolution in life on Earth, the emergence of a civilization creating species. About this revolution as I come in from the terrace with Nathaniel to remove my fresh-baked loaf from the oven. Nathaniel says he's starving, and well he might be after working the soil with me and dancing across the pumpkin vines on the slope. It is midsummer, and the vines have burst free from the terrace we built it for them, spreading across the hillside so rapidly that we joke about their taking over the world. While I carve for Nathaniel a steaming slice from the new hard-crusted loaf, it comes to me that it was this breakthrough, this mind of the farmer and bread baker and engineer, with its new conception of the relationship between the human and the living world, that laid the foundation for the human empire. And if you don't mind my stopping, I hope this adds to it. I say a new connection of the relationship between the human and the living world. And the way I articulate the essential newness is that the plants that people used to gather, they now control enough to plant and harvest. The animals, some of the animals that they used to hunt, they now exploit by bringing them under control like herders do with fences and all that. Things that used to be what nature spontaneously provided and fitting right into the natural order are all of a sudden transformed by this creative species, again, the human mind, that's able to invent its own way of life and really enters into a whole new situation. That's about the problems that situation creates. And that's what I say about this new conception of the relationship between the human and the living world laid the foundation for the human empire. And that's where the Christian Science Monitor got putting into the title, and the seeds of empire. And I guess seeds fit because I'm talking about agriculture, I'm talking about the yeast as a seed. And it was out of this kind of seed engineering that the human empire on this planet, which is magnificent and problematic at the same time. In the genius of the first bakers of bread, I realize, we find newly sprouted that vision of dominion, a vision that cultivated and extended over 5 millennia, has brought us, for better and for worse, to where we are today, to that dangerous growth of human pride, that has given us a globe-encompassing system of manipulation and production and exploitation that threatens to choke off the living systems that sustain us. Yeah, that's part of my spirituality, is that we have to be living in harmony with our planet, and we are destructive on our planet still. And that's what this climate crisis represents, that the human civilization, which I say has been fundamentally out of control from the beginning. I don't know what proportion is out of control, but an important part's out of control. That we just need to be in harmony with our planet, or we're going to destroy the foundations of our survival, because no creature can win against its environment for long. One of my major quotations, Gregory Bateson was the name of the ecological thinker who said that. No creature can win against its environment for long. And when you say what's for long, I don't know exactly what's for long, but civilization's been somewhat destructive about humans living off against their environment for thousands of years, which seems like for long. But what we're destroying is an order that emerged through the process of biological evolution for 3.5 billion years. So 10,000, 12,000 years is not for long if you're comparing it with that. We're like a species that we're born with a big bank balance on our bank book. And we've been spending it down by deforestation, by overgrazing, by washing away topsoil, and by disrupting the atmosphere. But we were born with such a rich heritage. 3.5 billion years had given us a whole lot of planet to exploit. But as we become more and more powerful, people like me and a lot of other people on different trips are feeling at a spiritual level the need to reconceive and reorder our relationship with the rest of life on Earth. That life on Earth includes the climate. Because, well, to some extent, life on Earth plays a role in the climate, even independently of us. But life on Earth is quite dependent on a degree of climatic stability. And rapid destabilization of the climate is very destructive of all kinds of wholeness that are embedded in the planet that we inherited 10,000 years ago, when our species had for a while been cultural enough to have some disruptive effects. And people are continually wondering, how much did human hunters contribute to the extermination of the woolly mammoth in North America, or I think they wonder about North Europe too. But in any event, as I follow that discussion, it's looking more and more like it was climate issues and not mostly human predation. But I also do believe that you can find that even before there was civilization, humans were becoming so efficient as hunters that there were some problems in the system, but they were minor compared to what emerges as soon as we start harnessing nature in altogether different ways. Controlling what we used to just take whatever nature dealt us. Big change, fraught with consequences. And one of the consequences is human civilization could be its own force of self-destruction. So recognizing at a spiritual level as much as we can about how we are called to build some more wholeness into the relationship where human civilization intersects all over the place with the rest of life on Earth. That something sustainable is necessary. or we're on a path of self-destruction. So it's fitting that there be that seeing that truth should connect us with the spiritual level, because I believe that the spiritual level tends to be, to the extent to which we are whole and see things clearly, tends to be life-serving. That's why it's there. And I think that what we experience as being a sacred mission to make human civilization in harmony with life on Earth touches on the sacred level. How could it not? What is there of value that is not dependent on the health of life on Earth? Even human fulfillment is dependent on our becoming in harmony with this planet, to have a different feeling about life on Earth than is manifested by these people who are willing, like the fossil fuel industry, to prevent human civilization from responding to the crisis in order to protect life on Earth and to protect our children and grandchildren, who are sacred to us when we hold our child, our newborn child, in our hand and maybe have a spiritual experience at that moment. Is because what matters, where it's at, has to do with life rather than death. That takes place at a whole lot of levels, and one of the levels has got to do with realizing that the human empire is both marvelous and really problematic. And if we don't address what's problematic, then we're really in danger of destroying everything that people in various ways look at and experience as of sacred value. There are many components of the spiritual level. This was a route for me. And when an American astronaut looked at the blue marble, there was a kind of seeing that took place then that was, I think, quite akin to my trip. We have human beings on this planet for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But it was only, I'm not sure what exactly are the years. We landed a man on the moon in 1969. The late 60s and early 70s, for the first time, we have a human being that is able to see the Earth from the vantage point where I think, what was the name of the, this guy became one of the founding members of something called the Institute for Noetic Sciences. Willis Harman was the guiding spirit of that. And they brought me in a few ways after my book came out. He, the astronaut, saw the Earth sitting out there all by itself, this beautiful blue marble, and he saw the fragility of it. I don't know what that fragility exactly looked like. He was probably in some way primed to see it in these terms, but in any event, it was a life-changing moment for him, and I believe that there are two American astronauts from that era whose lives were changed by a spiritually impactful experience that delivered an important spiritual truth about the need for us humans to take better care of our fragile and marvelous, beautiful planet. And he came back with this vision, this is how the spirit works. Apparently, I came back with my vision, which is quite compatible with that other one that he had. The need to take care of, to restore wholeness to this beautiful thing. he came back with his vision, and I don't know what exactly he did with it, but I was alive at the time, and before very long there was this poster called the Blue Marble that was, for his experience, what his moment of transformative spiritual experience. He he expressed by publishing into the world. I don't know exactly what his role was, or maybe people just got it from him. But it was all over the world pretty soon, hanging in the bedrooms of lots of people of the age to be against the Vietnam War and to constitute the rising environmental moment. Um, where we're at a time when even the Republican president, Richard Nixon, is the guy who founds the Environmental Protection Agency and appoints a relatively good guy, William Ruckelshaus, to head it. I mean, this was a moment where the spirit was speaking to us about the need to take better care of this planet. And then as where we are now, where one can't even imagine that we could have a Republican president that would create a whole major governmental agency with a mandate to try to make the activities of the American economy and consumption, including consumption, more harmonious with the needs of the environment. And at an age where a bipartisan vote, maybe a unanimous vote, I think my wife told me, a unanimous vote to create the Endangered Species Act. Well, things can happen at a spiritual level that are run by a force of brokenness and not the force of wholeness. It was the force of wholeness. I'm just willing to say, if I needed to take the time to show it, I could do it. That when this astronaut came back to Earth with a message that this is a fragile and beautiful planet and we should take better care of it. That was the gist of it. That was the force of wholeness expressing itself. That his spiritually transformative experience was coming from a place of wholeness. But then when you get the political party that had created the Environmental Protection Agency changing over time into something that does the bidding of a fossil fuel industry that wants to do everything it can to prevent our civilization responding to this challenge in a way that will erode their short-term profits. Getting off the stuff they're selling is not good for their bottom line, so they don't want us to do what we need to do to protect life on Earth and the future generations, who are our children and our grandchildren and the rest of our descendants. Now, which sounds like wholeness to you? I had a discussion here about with Forrest last week about he wanted to reserve the idea of the spiritual dimension for what's positive, and I'm not sure which illuminates things better. I think there's a sense in which we have evolved to have a spiritual capacity that that naturally would be delivering us messages of wholeness, but is subject to being co-opted, hijacked, broken by things in the world that can twist us around so that what we end up doing is not really in the service of wholeness. So do you want to call, when people sort of get taken over by something that, mistaking the way I've put it many times over the last decade, I say that the problem in the secular world is that the problem in the traditional conservative world is that uh, they've been mistaking the evil for the good. The evil comes in front of them, presents itself as the good, and they buy the lie. And the problem on the liberal side has been a failure to recognize that there really are forces of wholeness and brokenness that behave very much like good and evil. And rather than mistaking the good for the evil, they don't recognize how central the concepts of good and evil are for understanding the human drama. Good and evil defined and in ways that can be shown to be operating, can be shown by a well-trained social scientist like I was trained to be, that is a coherent force that consistently works to make things worse, or in the case of the good, consistently works to make things better. The secular worldview fell down on the job because they did not have a way of conceiving what was actually happening on the other side, where people were mistaking the evil for the good, and a lot of good people migrated over in terms of the struggle for power over the country, which is what we do in our elections. They migrated from the side where they mostly weighed on the side of the good. And I would say that if you look over the whole sweep of American history, conservative America has, on balance, been as much for the good, maybe not quite as far as I'm a liberal, but in many ways has been a source of virtue as well as the brokenness. But then the liberal side has also been a source of virtue and brokenness. So it's not like anybody's had a monopoly on wisdom. But there was a transformation that occurred when people started mistaking the good for the evil. And the people on the other side, to whom the job fell to prevent that force from gaining in power by making it pay a political price, failed to do so. And so as the Republican Party has been doing more and more, that's more and more broken, over the course of 30 years, they gained a lot of power by aligning itself more and more with the forces of brokenness. So both sides of the system played a role in letting what has become nakedly a force of fascism, which is another way of labeling a particular political pattern involved in how power operates in a society, to allow fascism to gain such a foothold in our country beyond what anybody in America I grew up in would have imagined possible. That the survival of American democracy is actually in doubt. So one part of the spiritual task of these times is to recognize the reality of these coherent forces that operate in the human world that can be shown, why a force of brokenness would inevitably arise for any civilization creating, that's what that book purports to show. But then to show how that ramifies through the system, and that what we see happening, for example, in America today and in Ukraine, that these are parts of a greater drama between forces of wholeness and forces of brokenness. And the fate of human civilization is at stake. Everything that astronaut would say was sacred is at stake. The well-being of our descendants, the babies that we can imagine holding in our arms, is sacred, because people can experience them that way, and the quality of the experience is that's where it's at. there's a need for a lot of good people to awaken to the nature of what they're actually supporting. Uh, or to stop giving themselves permission to support what perhaps they also understand they're supporting that's so broken, so contrary to the values they say they have. I publish a op-ed piece every weekend in newspapers in the very Republican-oriented district where I was a candidate for Congress, the Democratic nominee for Congress. And I often write my best effort to have an impact on the conservatives that make up the majority of this region where these newspapers and I have some knowledge of these people, and I've had real affection, respect, appreciation for them when I did hundreds and hundreds of hours of talk radio conversations with them over the course of a decade. And I've watched something happen to them that's disturbing and that I don't entirely understand. But in any event, I address them on a regular basis when I see something that I can do that's meaningful in the terms that I understand meaningfulness, in the hope that somehow it will register also with the people that I'm trying to address. I don't have a lot of confidence about that. But I don't know what to do besides just do what I can. And I think that there are a lot of things that need to be done, and that America as a whole has an important task that I don't think is taken on well enough, which is that we've got a lot of good people who have somehow migrated over to the wrong side of the teeter-totter and allowing the side of evil control where the teeter-totter goes. So that's one of the points that I try to make on a regular basis, is that we have a enormous cultural need to take whatever it is that's out there now, that's enabling a leader who's like that, to persuade a whole lot of people of things that are so obviously untrue in the face of mountains and mountains of evidence, and to support somebody who's got all of the defects that the guys up on Mount Rushmore would say. That's precisely what you don't want wielding the powers of the presidency. Whatever it is that's out there, I've written a couple dozen pieces trying to speculate about it, but I always recognize or acknowledge that there's a part of it that I just don't understand. But I do what I can, given what I can. And this piece just ran over this past weekend. I had intended for it to be closer to Memorial Day, but then came what the Republicans did going up to New York during the trial, that incredible sight of a whole political party siding with the criminal against the rule of law before the verdict and then after the verdict, putting out the complete bogus false accusations about weaponization of the Justice Department. I just felt like this piece could last past Memorial Day, but I had to address that, and I called that piece and then I did like on the cartoon, ampersand Thatch, like Look at the blankety blank evidence, exclamation point was the name of that piece. And then this, a week later, this got published. I observed this Memorial Day by thinking about those members of the greatest generation who fought and won World War II, especially those who gave their lives to defeat the fascist forces of Nazi Germany and the cruel conquerors from Japan. Millions of Americans in the military endured so much. And in order to defeat those enemies, hundreds of thousands forfeited the chance to live out their full lives. How are we to understand what those Americans died for? It's more than just being for one's country in the same way we might want our side, our team, to win when we identify with the NFL team that happens to reside in our region. More admirable is the idea of protecting one's land and people from enemies. That's been part of the human society's ethos since the beginnings of civilization. But when one looks at the history of our America, there's always been something more, something special, even sacred, in our national understanding of what our nation stands for and fights for. Namely, America's special quality as a democratic society, the land of the free, sweet land of liberty. That was especially true about World War II. The Allied leaders, FDR and Churchill, defined the meaning of that war in such terms. As they led the fight against enemy regimes, they operated in complete violation of those basic values that inspired our founders to create the American Republic. And that same moral spirit was deeply embedded in the dozens of movies made in America during World War II. I'm a watcher of old movies. It's one of the places where I go back in time to study American culture. Our boys were fighting for decency and for the rights of people to form the government of their choice. When Lincoln spoke of what those soldiers died for at Gettysburg, when Lincoln resolved that these honored dead shall not have died in vain, unquote, he described the purpose as being that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. They died, in other words, for American democracy. So when I think of the sacrifice of the people we honor on Memorial Day, I think of them as having died to protect those sacred American values. They died for the nation the world has long honored for our breakthrough to democracy, for the nation the French celebrated by giving us that fabulous gift, the Statue of Liberty, who died to save the world from fascism. And here I make the political turn. You know, I'm not a tricky guy, but I have a way of trying to lead the conservatives along a trail, and just when they're getting comfortable, bring something on them. Here's something. Which makes it disturbing to think of all those millions of Americans among us today who think they're honoring our fallen dead, yet are planning to vote for something deeply akin to that fascist form of government those Americans sacrificed their lives to defeat. Ben Franklin famously said when asked what our founders had given us Americans. A republic, if you can keep it. That's the quotation, for one of the quotations for which Franklin is famous. But keeping it turns out not to be as automatic as I used to think. Apparently, if things go wrong somehow, you can lose it. I don't spell out the somehow here. A friend of mine recently said, I used to think we're better than that being the possibility, visible in this moment, that the American people might actually choose to move toward an authoritarian, fascistic, strongman, dictatorial form of government. He and I agreed that we used to be better than that. But now, maybe we're not. The polls suggest that there's a real chance that the American electorate will choose to give the powers of the presidency to a leader who has declared openly his intention to sweep away the American system of government, of the rule of law, of checks and balances, so the leader can wield power arbitrarily. We know which side FDR and Churchill would support in the war Putin's Russia inflicted on democratic Ukraine. But millions of Americans, even while thinking patriotic thoughts about the soldiers that died under the command of FDR and Churchill this Memorial Day, are planning to vote for a leader who clearly sides with the fascist dictator in Russia, whose tyranny over his people and aggression against his neighbors resemble those of the Nazis, and whose war crimes are like those of the Japanese aggressors in Asia. Seems something's amiss when people who honor those who died to keep the government by the people and for the people from perishing from the earth are planning to vote for a leader who claims to be above the law. We can now see that defending America entails not only battles against external enemies. Now it's a domestic political battle that's fought at the ballot box, while victory requires enlisting the support of the American people. We can infer that our founders foresaw that both kinds of battle needed to be fought from how they framed the oath they required all those who serve in the people's government to take. The oath to protect the Constitution, quote, against enemies, foreign and domestic, unquote. Our founders knew that the Constitution was the heart and essence of the nation they bequeathed to us. So fighting to defend the heart and soul of America in our times requires defeating at the ballot box both the leader and the party that does his bidding, who no longer even hides his intention to dismantle the American constitutional order. It dishonors our fallen dead, who died not for a flag, but for America's core values, to give support to a domestic enemy of the sacred spirit of American democracy, for which so many have fought and died. What do I want to say about that journey we've just made? Well, it's a view into one of the forms that the brokenness is taking in our times. When people who really would say sincerely, and I think that there are a lot of people here in Virginia Shenandoah Valley who would say with great sincerity that they are American patriots, and who, if invited to articulate the nature of their patriotism, would stress a lot of those values that conservatives have always articulated in town squares on the 4th of July. And then they support somebody who's very flagrantly, not hiddenly like Richard Nixon did with his crimes, very flagrantly assaulting all the various components of the American order, the rule of law, not only through his crimes, but by his trying to delegitimize the American system of justice, even as it's performing its duties exactly the way it's supposed to, up until you reach the point where the power to help the criminal against the rule of law has been taken over by the force that he represents, that he's aligned with. The trials were proceeding scrupulously in terms of the indictments that were brought, in terms of the investigation, in terms of the nothing the least bit untoward about, I mean, just sort of so by the book and meticulous by the Attorney General, other than he delayed way too long. That's another story. And certainly the special counsel and also Alvin Bragg in New York and the judges in these cases that have found against Donald Trump, all of these things just so clearly operating by the book, by the facts and the law. And but the whole political party rallying behind the guy who's already shown that he's not constrained by custom or norm or the Constitution or the rule of law. It's not exactly hidden that he tried to overturn an election, which is the foundation of the constitutional process. It's not exactly hidden that he's a monster. I mean, just look what he did. Look at the whole history of the relationship between him and the obsequious Mike Pence, his groveling, sycophantic vice president. What kind of human being would consider that when the guy sort of refuses to commit a crime for you, that's an offense worthy of sending a crowd to kill him? Send another tweet to inflame things even worse when they're already chanting, hang Mike Pence. What? Nothing hidden at all. So a lot of brokenness has made a lot of progress over the last 30 years. And we're coming to a showdown. Let me this one is a little scary for me to deal with, but I'm going to do it. I'm in an awkward position. There's fortunately and unfortunately, like the story about the guy who fell out of a plane, and fortunately there's a pitchfork, a haystack underneath him. Unfortunately, there's a pitchfork in the, anyway. Fortunately, I feel certain that my better human story says some things that are valid and would have important beneficial impacts if it was more widely recognized. That, for me, is a given. It puts me in the awkward position that I'm not in a position to talk as if that were true, gracefully. I'm not Louis Pasteur getting, some kind of Nobel Prize for I don't know if Pasteur got the Nobel Prize, but I'm too much of a nobody to be able to say that without it being awkward. But nonetheless, I do believe that it's true, and all I ask is that people actually check it out. My motive in my life is basically that I should get it out there better than I have before I die, and I'm 78. That's in a nutshell. My idea, that one, if that were all it was, it would still be what I said. That came to me in 1970, and it turns out that there's a lot of other things that can be derived from it that are important. And so the Better Human Story, that I call this thing, and my website's at betterhumanstory.org, puts that together with a bunch of other things to make a integrated picture. And but that was a work of a lot of integration too. When I took my comprehensives, PhD comprehensives, that was first a 1,600-page dissertation, and I had a committee at Berkeley that was to put me through my paces about the fields that I claimed to be putting together, and there were a dozen such fields that they were basically authorized to press me on. So it's got to do with seeing things whole. And that by itself, not just in the 1,600 page, but all the essential stuff is in that one book from the University of California Press. It did get out there, and it put a lot of pieces together. It got a full-page review in the New York Times, and cut to the chase. After making something of a splash, and after making bold claims and then backing them up with trying to lay out a very airtight, watertight argument for certain propositions that, if they were true, would have enormous ramifications about how we understand a lot of fundamental questions. I wouldn't have thought it would be possible to be in the place where by the early 90s, the book had come out, paperback from Houghton Mifflin, and by the early 90s, the idea was kind of disappearing from the world. I had thought when I saw what I first saw, like, oh, wow. I mean, that was a bigger wow than the forest is coming. I thought, wait till they get a load of me, like the Joker says in Batman. Now, wait till they get a load of this. It really wasn't about me, as much as I like recognition. I was sort of looking forward to a bit of that. I was brought up liking to get recognition for what I do, but not that. The main thing was I anticipated there's going to be an impact on the world if I were able to lay it out so that you could see that you're drawn to that conclusion. There's really no choice. And I wrote the first chapter of that book 9 times to get to this is the best I can do to get the reader to recognize that there's no way out, that you got to conclude this. And I thought that the reader was going to conclude that. And then there would be, I mean, in my mind, it would be so compelling that right away there would be kind of a revolution in thinking. I don't know if I've really understood how revolutionary ideas do penetrate. I've studied a little bit of the history of science, and Newton's ideas really seem to get out there in a hurry. Darwin's ideas seem to be pretty impactful, even if people didn't understand them very fully right at first, I don't think. Anyway, I would have thought that if that way of understanding what's happened to our species, that we got caught up in an evolutionary process that we did not choose, a social evolutionary process, did not choose but could not avoid, that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large, that this is an inevitable consequence of taking the step that we took 10,000 years ago. I thought that when people saw that, they would be blown away and at least wrestling with it. Well, what are the implications of that? Well, what about this objection? What about that objection? And wrestle with it. Do we have to draw that conclusion? Is there some way around that argument? I was looking forward to people wrestling with it because I felt a lot of confidence. And how could they not? I actually did have a certain amount of credentials. Like I'm not supposed to be a kind of person that you just would ignore in the thinking world. I really don't want to brag, but my academic record up until that point, graduating summa cum laude from Harvard College and writing a book that they thought should be published about things not entirely unakin to the vision of the parable of the tribes, and published by the University of California Press in a way that says this is a big deal. And then the New York Times, my publicist said, well, whatever the review says, the New York Times is saying this is a big deal. 7 years later, it hadn't been refuted. People were not wrestling with it. As the years went by, sometimes books came out that you would think, that book should be at least in the bibliography. But there's no evidence that they even knew that the book existed. I'm serious. You look in the bibliography of Sapiens, for example. I mean, it's hard for me to know how you wouldn't put my book in there, because it's a version of why the history of civilization has unfolded the way it has. It hasn't been refuted, and it's laid out in as strong a way as I could with having been trained to do that kind of thing. But it actually had disappeared. So one of the hardest challenges that I've faced in my life, and I hope it's not too much chutzpah for me to talk to you as if I believe that you could see things, the way I do. But I sort of made a vow of just being honest about this sort of thing. I have pondered, what does it mean? I mean, many times I've gone back into, am I fooling myself? Is this, do I have some delusions of grandeur? I never conclude that. And I'm not the only one who doesn't conclude that. But then, the world I thought that I lived in was a world in which if you pulled that off and challenged people that, hey, look at it this way, and you'll feel compelled to rethink X, Y, and Z, I would have thought that people would feel compelled to. So I've had 30 years plus now to ponder that. My wife doesn't understand it either. And I've talked about some possibilities. One of them is that I'm really struck by the fact that, as far as I can tell, the intellectual culture of our times not only doesn't have my integrative picture of the human story ensconced in some meaningful way, and a lot of people thinking that way. There's nothing else occupying that role, playing that role. I often talk about how as I came of age intellectually in the second half of the 50s and through the 60s, there were two major thinkers, Freud and Marx, who at that time played a role in providing a perspective that a lot of people thought was important for understanding what's going on in the human world. Different perspectives, whether it's Marxian or Freudian, but both of them had big roles. I don't believe that anybody is playing that role now. So maybe part of my experience is that I'm offering something which may be the real deal in the terms that I'm presenting it, but there's no market for that. And that would, if that were true, and I do think that that's a piece of the truth, that would lead to asking some questions about what are the reasons why I would say that our culture is less into big picture views of things than any time in the history of Western thinking over the last whatever centuries that I'm kind of familiar with. I don't know if that's exactly true. I mean, I've never, made a study of it, but it's my feeling that we've become more fragmented. Things in pieces, all coherence gone. Milton wrote those lines, and I'm not sure if they're related or not, but um, thinking in America around the turn of the century has got a lot more integrative qualities to it. Um, by the time I got the idea of the parable of the tribes, I was reading a book about American academia at that time, which is a long time ago, like 50 or 60 years, called The Broken Image, about how specialization and the breakdown of fields into fields and subfields and specialties, and people were not seeing things whole. But I think there may be other aspects of it, but in my view, the spiritual dimension requires seeing things whole. So if you get into an intellectual habit where you don't see that this is connected with that, which is connected with that, you're not going to see the human world. You're not going to see what the drama is here. There's a lot of layers that are in it that unfold, and when you see it, then you can sort of understand what the challenges are that we face. But if you're just looking at the daily headlines, well, so that was one idea I had. I'm selling a product that I grew up thinking was like the Holy Grail with my dad, who was a social thinker. And my favorite part of our relationship was talking about, cultures and civilizations and history and the dynamics of things. And he was very good. He was a professor of economics and a man of, he died when I was 21 and he's been missed. But anyway, in my family culture, if you could come up with something that does what I claim my thing does, wow, big deal. You think you're going to get carried off the field and with straddling the shoulder pads of your teammates, but it hasn't been that way at all. And maybe it's because there's not a conceptual opening for really a big integrative picture. Maybe people don't believe that such a thing is possible. I've got various thoughts. I'm going to skip that. Let's see, there was a second thing that I thought. Oh, sometimes people would say to me, people who thought that it was a big deal, but that I'm ahead of my time. I heard that a lot back in the 90s. And I would ask, what does that mean, ahead of my time? Um, I couldn't quite understand because, there's the evidence and there's the logic, and it felt almost like mathematics. If you say 2x plus 5 is equal to 25, it doesn't take you very long to understand that x must be 10. So how can you be ahead of your time when it's like that? Well, I don't know if I'm ahead of my time. Well, some people have said it was kind of bad news. Like I was emphasizing in this book. Um, I delivered the message as if it was a humbling thing to recognize that we haven't been the masters of our destiny. And I do believe that we should be humbled in that way, but it also lets us off some important hooks that are painful hooks, like original sin and stuff like that. But I delivered it as we ain't such hot stuff. We've been not the masters of human civilization so much as the victims of a social evolutionary process that we stumbled into, which was inevitable. As soon as you leave the niche in which you evolved biologically by inventing your own way of life, you're already off and running in a certain direction. And that is the heart of the point. But I thought it was inescapable once you read it. And then I discovered that I'm sort of assuming something about how my thinking will map onto somebody else's thinking. Not in a way that makes me question my thinking. Sorry to say, I apologize. But I've encountered a couple of forms of people's minds being shaped in certain ways. It seemed like maybe that's part of the problem. I mean, I read earlier The Mind of the Bread Baker, how people who are, a few millennia of the mind of the farmer created the mind of the bread baker because the two processes are directly analogous, as I laid out. And that being a way of understanding, I'm just sort of really intrigued with human consciousness these days. I feel like I'm only on the edges of understanding the possible ways for it to be formed. The farmer's way of getting cultivated was one of them, but I've encountered that with respect to my success or lack of success in laying out, that basic idea, even without the other ones that I built on it. I've discovered that some things that are obvious to me, that I lay out, I think, super clearly, don't get across because there's a prior way of thinking. For example, I've had an experience recently, and I had experience back in the 90s, late 80s, of a really, really intelligent guy who described himself as a fan of the Parable of the Tribes. He was in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, the author of a biography, a very interesting one that won the Pulitzer Prize. Smart guy, and making a contribution in a variety of ways that I very much respected. I was talking to him about my idea, which is, I'll just say it in a nutshell, that if you step across, if you take the fateful step, and that's another name of a series I've got on my website, betterhumanstory.org. If you take the fateful step out of the niche in which you evolved biologically by inventing your own way of life, onto the path of civilization, because that's how I define civilization, you're inevitably going to be compelled to make the spirit of the gangster wield a disproportionate voice on how the human world is going to be organized and how it's going to evolve. That a force gets unleashed that's not a function of the human creature. It is a result of the inevitable systemic dynamics of the system of civilized societies that did not evolve by natural selection like everything else in the biosphere. A new kind of life form that's been invented rather than chosen by natural selection, entering a new kind of system of where they're going to interact, inevitably generating a selective force that mandates that what is going to control things will be not distributed across all the various human capacities and the various kinds of culture that we might, but will be specifically geared toward societies that are able to survive in a disordered system that inevitably generates a war of all against all. So there's a selection process for certain kinds of human and cultural social options. That's what that book's about. It's about a systemic force. So here I am in the home of this Harvard professor. We had just come back from Big Sur near Monterey or something like that, where we were working together as part of a team to how do we end the Cold War um, peacefully, um, rather than the nuclear holocaust that people were afraid of in the, before, while Reagan was confronting the Soviets earlier in that decade. And before Reagan and Gorbachev somehow got us on the path to a peaceful settlement. So anyway, we're concerned about questions of wholeness and the way civilization is ordered. And ending the Cold War was a big, important step. How do we get to the other side without killing ourselves? Anyway, in that context, he and I had worked together, and he read The Parallel Tribes, and we started talking about it. And I discovered fairly early on in the conversation that he was reducing everything to human psychology. It wasn't about a systemic force. It was about things like some inherent inclination toward conflict and struggle for domination. Um, I, I thought that was, I didn't draw the conclusion that that was going to be any major issue in the world. I thought, well, this guy's, his field is psychiatry. He's been in the field for, what is he, late 50s, long time. His thinking has sort of made it maybe a little difficult to move from the idea that the whole is only to be understood in the sum, as in terms of the sum of the parts. But that's not the case. Really, the essence of the idea he had missed, which is it's not the nature of the creature. It's the incredible, it's the inevitable systemic dynamics that make civilization out of control, that the comprehensive system of civilized societies has no order to make sure that the interactions among the actors is consistent with the needs of the system, the long-term viability of the system. That's true if you look at the way the biosphere evolves. I use the line, the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. But when you get civilized societies devouring each other, they have not been structured in any kind of synergistic and viable way. It's anarchy, and anarchy generates a war of all against all. It leads to the selection for the kinds of things that can prevail. And one way of talking about that is the spirit of the gangster. And then I've encountered that same difficulty in recognizing that systemic forces can control what happens, not because of human choice. And I've been using the idea of the difference between a fire breaking out in certain circumstances where people get trampled to death because they don't, because that's what happens when you have a fire and the door is open inward and people can't get out, versus the fire drill culture where you're able to establish an order. I think that actually is a fairly good metaphor for what happened to us civilizing human beings, that we found ourselves in a kill or be killed kind of situation where a lot of things get trampled. And it's a function of the systemic dynamic. Now, how many people have difficulty understanding all the ways that systems can have dynamics of their own? I do that again also with, I, I, in a way that I don't think any other book that criticizes the market system. My book, The Illusion of Choice, How the Market Shapes our Destiny, is the only one that actually looks at the market and the challenges it poses. It's a wonderful tool, but it really needs to be it needs for society to recognize and correct against the systemic dynamics that are built into it. That's another system, but they are analogous in that if we leave our fate to the market, we end up with a fossil fuel industry that might destroy the planet because of what they do to our politics to prevent our responding to the climate change crisis. And it's very analogous to the systemic dynamic that operates in the intersocietal system, where it's still the case that the wolf of Putin's Russia can fall on the lamb uh, of Zelensky's democratic Ukraine. And there's nothing to make sure that they're working on any kind of perpetual motion machine to make sure that human civilization can survive for the long haul. Not like the lion and the zebra in the grass, you know. So I don't know how much. It's a new idea I've got that maybe the way people think and the way I'm asking people to think, maybe it's the people. My mind has been, turned into a farmer of some kind, where I've got all these things that work because I've been thinking in these terms for such a long time. And maybe I'm going up against people who don't see the whole as more than, and that connects with that other idea about, why is it that I mean, I understand why Freud and Marx have lost a lot of their prestige, but why isn't somebody else in such a position? Seeing things in parts, in the pieces. To see, we human beings we're for, well, we emerged out of a biologically evolved system. We have ancestors that go back, we have Homo sapiens that go back hundreds of thousands of years, 300,000 maybe. We got Homo whatever that go back another couple million, and you got Australopithecus, and we got, what's that preface that um, the chimpanzees have got theirs. But anyway, we go back to primates. We go back to what mammals there were after the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs. And we go back way before that. We go back into the water. We go back to be where there was before there was DNA or even a complete cell. I mean, it's just the way life works. It's really important that we recognize the wholeness of that system because it's a way of showing us what life requires and our survival is going to require that we order our civilization, a civilization that inevitably emerged into a disorder. But if you don't see that inevitability, then you don't understand why we're confronting something like a force of fascism. The better we see things whole, the more likely we are to be able to protect what we hold sacred. Human thriving, human survival, the thriving of life on Earth itself. And that pretty well sums it up for me. I mean, human thriving contains a whole lot of stuff. Things being ordered in some life-serving way. We've compelled ourselves to create that kind of an order by leaving the order that was handed to us. There's no going back. But it does help if we recognize that effects in the systems that have been governing too much how human civilization has evolved. the force of brokenness that inevitably arose. The way the market system is sensitive to the things that to the values that we bring into the market as buyers and sellers, but doesn't know how to pay attention to the values that are at stake in our interconnectedness. There's a bunch of stuff that can be said there, like that the illusion of choice says. So let me the struggle. I don't know what I'm going to say about how much do human needs determine how civilization develops. You know, I'm confident that there's something really important to be seen that I'm trying to get out there and better. I don't know, you know, how much of human civilization, how much of the brokenness that we find in our world is to be explained by my better human story. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure it's plenty. Because, for example, if you compare the lives of hunter-gatherers, say 12,000 years ago, which is all we had at that time, and we were all over the planet, and then you compare that with how human beings were living 5,000 years ago, and the condition for the average person was way worse. Even the life expectancy had fallen, and the quality of the diet we can infer from the skeletons was much worse. And I've got an anthropological quote someplace in there that no hunter and gathering society has gone over to civilization as if to a greater good. And I can believe it. You know, when most people were living, when the evolution of civilization brought evolution from our human society from hunting gathering to the full-blown cities and empires, and you know, with rulers and armies and slave labor for a great proportion of people, it was downhill. The course that human life took for 5,000 years, I think, is manifestly downhill from better circumstances to worse circumstances. We, me, you presumably, are pretty fortunate human beings in the context of the whole history of humanity in terms of the conditions of our lives. You know, I manage money carefully enough to live a decent life as if I had made a middle class income, which I mostly didn't. And I live in a society where I've been free to be you and me. You know, way better than most people have had it. But the fact that the evolution of civilization for such a long period selected for what ended up being these societies of tyrants and slaves and armies and conquests and cruelties, I think we can conclude that the selection for the ways of power, the disproportionate voice given to the spirit of the gangster, was a function of the systemic dynamic. I mean, it could not have been. How many people do you know who are as broken and ugly as human beings as, well, let's say, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu? I know a fair number of people. I don't know anybody at that level. I mean, people sometimes say about Trump, he's not only like he, not somebody you wouldn't want to give the powers of the presidency, but you wouldn't even want to have him visit you, be at your dining room table with your children. I mean, that seems fairly clear to me. And Putin, what he's willing to do to other people. And Netanyahu, look what he's been willing to do to keep his coalition together in order to keep himself in power, even at the cost of the important interests of Israeli democracy, as Israel as a endangered sovereign nation, and Israel as a democracy. He's like Trump. He's if it serves him, he'll do it. I didn't always know that he was that far gone into sociopathy, but it's been obvious for a while. It's kind of sad. I mean, he's got a lot of intelligence, but he's a sociopath. And those three guys, they're three of the four guys that I would say on this planet are having the biggest impact on how the world is unfolding right now in our times. Putin with his invasion of Ukraine, Trump with his what he's doing to the American Constitution, democracy, and the rule of law, and Netanyahu with the choices that he's been making in a situation where the peace of the world and the security of Israel are very much at stake. I never have claimed that I knew how Israel should respond to October 7th. I would be very interested to sit in on a group of wise men going back to October 7th and saying, okay, well, how should we respond to this? And I always think that the options, if once you got creativity engaged, it's not like you either do this or you do that. It's like a whole vast, what's the word I'm looking for? Painters have a whole vast palette of possibilities and combinations of things you can do. But I feel sure that a group of wise men would never have made the choices that the Israelis have made. So ugly, so stupid, jumped right into the trap that Hamas set for them. That is why Hamas doesn't agree even to the terms that they themselves said that they agreed to a few weeks ago. They don't want to, as long as Israel keeps on doing things in the trap they set for them, they're not interested in ending the conflict. They're achieving their purposes. And what's Netanyahu's purpose? Staying in power, staying out of jail. That's how it looks to me anyway. So, the problem that we face in the world as it is right now isn't just about those individuals. Clearly, there's a larger force of brokenness that's at work in our world. These leaders are, in some senses, expressions of it, and also, promote it. So it causes and effects both. But we can see other places where brokenness is in operation. Besides, in America, for example, besides Trump, and also, well, you have the Republican Party that went up to New York to do that unprecedented thing, calling into question weaponization of the Justice Department and I mean, it's so grotesque. I actually want to study the word grotesque. I think there's so much that's grotesque right now. I want to know how to talk about it. But the problem with Biden's DOJ is just the opposite of what their Republicans are accusing them. And this is a party that's willing to, in order to maintain its position, because Trump dominates the base that makes him the nominee. And Trump punishes anybody who gets out of line and rewards those who are totally loyal to him. With the 225 project is going to be, God preserve us from having that fate. They went up there, and I don't think any political party's ever done anything like that in terms of delegitimizing American system of justice with no evidence whatsoever of any wrongdoing. And that points to another part of the brokenness that we've got, is that they can do that with confidence that the Republican base that they don't want to get on the wrong side of will support them in doing that because they support Donald Trump. So there's something going on over there, which is the important reservoir of the brokenness. The Republican Party, I think, was willing, I'd say even maybe eager. If they could have been done with Trump in the second impeachment, then why wouldn't they have done it? Why did they acquit him? If they had convicted him, well, it turns out anyway that the base was for Trump, and the Republicans really could not afford to go against Trump in his big lie about the election being stolen without suffering the kind of punishment that Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger suffered. They lost their positions. So we've got this leader, we've got this party that's willing to go up to New York, even though they got no evidence of any of the stuff they say. And I assume that they know better, because I don't think they're that stupid. And they say these things, and they appease Trump, and they don't get on the wrong side of the base that's got a lot of intelligent people. But they're not offended by these lies. They don't recognize them as lies. And then we've got the Supreme Court. Now, if you look on my YouTube channel, I hope you'll subscribe if you find me at all interesting. I've done a fair amount of talking about today's Supreme Court. And I think that the best way to sum it up is that I claim that the Supreme Court has been captured not only by a political party, but by a political party that has transformed itself into a force of fascism beyond anything we've ever seen in American history with any major American party. I mean, there used to be an American Nazi party, Rockwell or whatever his name was, in the 50s and 60s. I mean, there was a French, and there was a John Birch Society with a lot of craziness. But now we've got a major political party that's really into all that stuff. And the Supreme Court is yet another place where we got to look to see exactly what it is that we're up against. And that book up there is my 2015 book, which is called What We're Up Against, which is that there are a lot of dimensions to these things that fit together. And what's happened on the Supreme Court and what's happened in the Republican Party nominating a guy that we really know is guilty of a lot more than what he's already been convicted of. And we know that he's an honest jury, I have no reason to doubt the honesty of the jury, found him as guilty of having sexually assaulted a woman and then defamed her. I mean, it's just, the picture is not obscure. But we've got a criminal that we've seen. I follow this stuff very closely, and I'm not really one to say that I know what I don't know. I am convinced beyond a reasonable doubt of his guilt on the various. I mean, if I was on the jury, I would require that the prosecution show it in terms of the facts and the law in front of me in a court. I believe in that process. But it doesn't mean that we have to be stupid and not pay attention to what we've been shown. Rare are the times that we get shown as much as we've been shown to enable us to draw a conclusion. And as citizens, I think we're entirely right to draw conclusions that Trump is unindicted. I mean, he's just guilty of a whole raft of crimes having to do with trying to overturn the election, and he's guilty of a bunch of crimes having to do with endangering national security, violations of the Espionage Act, stuff like that. I'd be interested to see the trials. I mean, I would be interested too, because the prosecutions have been so expert in how they do these things, and I was interested in seeing how the case was laid out to this jury in Manhattan, and so well that they had no difficulty concluding, yeah, it's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt in every four. Yeah, I don't know how important it is to talk about 34. I mean, what is it? Two different batches of crimes, but in any event, guilty. And not a trivial crime, because he was cheating and how he was going about trying to become president of the United States. That isn't trivial. I mean, he's a cheater in every game he plays, and he's cheating when he goes and he claims that the judge is this Trump hater, and this is leftist weaponization. It's just all garbage, obviously garbage. Well, the Supreme Court, it was entirely obvious what the Supreme Court should do with the appeal that came to him from the appeal that Trump was making about presidential immunity. Everybody said it was an absurd argument that Trump was putting forward, and it was. And it was demolished by Judge Chutkan, and then it was demolished even more by a panel on the circuit court, which I think was headed by a Republican appointee. I mean, there was no need for any of what the Supreme Court has done, and yet we can see that they're not stupid either. They basically said, we're going to help Trump here. He wants delay. He doesn't want people to know what they'd find out if the trial were conducted before the election. That's the crucial thing. Trump's big interest is getting elected president so he can kill all the cases against him. And he's not going to get elected as readily if people can see that he's committed some of the most serious crimes in American history, trying to overthrow the constitutional order, inciting an insurrection. No small thing. Well, the Supreme Court has been helping him. But I think it's a mistake to think of the Supreme Court as motivated in a pro-Trump way. I would bet that, I've looked a little bit into, thanks to Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, he's presented a picture of how the plutocracy has basically been buying the Supreme Court and corrupting the Supreme Court. And one of the things I say is the problem is less that they go on these junkets and get millions of dollars worth of favors from the billionaire class. The problem is really that they got put onto this court by the court, by the very force that's rewarding them for making decisions that serve their interests. But the force that put him on the court, with the Federalist Society and the money that Whitehouse has identified as being how fascism. Well, I actually think when it comes to the Supreme Court, it's less about fascism and more about plutocracy. I think I could be wrong about that, but there's a marriage between those two on the American right now, and the people who saw to it that there was this funnel taking people like John Roberts and Alito and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett. There's like a farm team out there that's grooming potential Supreme Court justices and has been working on it for more than 40 years, I think. And that's the force that they owe their allegiance to. So I wouldn't be surprised if the plutocracy would have been just as glad to be rid of Trump, because he's kind of crazy and becoming more so. I mean, I think the dementia problem, I'm very curious to see what happens with this dementia story. The question boils down to, between now and the time people go to vote, mostly on election day, but early voting too, how much of the American people will have become aware that Trump is evidently suffering some significant cognitive breakdown of a dementia sort? Now, I don't claim I know that 100%. I'm pretty sure, because I've been reading about a variety of neurologists who are expert in these kinds of things, who are able to point out this is a sign of that, at the level of the brain and its dysfunctions. So, sharks and batteries. I mean, this is kind of bizarre. And how much of that is going to get through? I think it would be, history will be very interested if it turns out that American democracy survives, because the guy who will be 82 got enough votes when enough of the American people decided this guy's losing it. He's gone off the deep end. He's not only crazy, he's incoherent, he's unhinged. I don't know. I think it's coming out more and more. I can see it accelerating, and some of the neurologists talk about it's accelerating too. But what I don't know is how many Americans will have the capacity to see it and or listen and hear people tell them that this is going on. I just don't know. The America I'm living in now is one that I feel like, though I think about it full time, there are just so many mysterious things that go on at the level of human consciousness. I mean, I don't understand how an intelligent person can, for example, believe that the election was stolen when a little bit of exposure to the evidence shows that's not true. Similarly with Trump saying, I did nothing wrong, versus the 88 indictments. I mean, the 88 indictments were handed down in a way that shows, oh, this is the justice system working exactly how it should, and showing that nobody's above. But nonetheless, there are a lot of smart people who are at least saying to pollsters that they don't see what's clearly true. So we got, I think that there may be a real story here, though I don't assume that everybody's going to recognize what's being shown right in front of their faces. I hope that there is in this debate that comes up between Biden and Trump, that Biden will make use of that time. Trump has been daring him, challenging him to submit himself to a cognitive test. That's an entree for Biden, assuming, as I believe, that he's really not in bad shape at all, to return by right in the debate issuing a challenge that they undergo a full battery of tests, physical and cognitive, and that the full results of those tests, conducted at one of America's most prestigious medical facilities, Mayo or the Cleveland Clinic or Johns Hopkins, and that the results would be made public. I would put down a fair amount of money that the reports are going to say, in, in effect, that Biden gives good promise of being able to uh, serve as wield the powers of the presidency competently from the next 4 years, and that Donald Trump does not. I put down, what would I take as the odds on that? Well, I don't know what if there's any health issues that Biden has that are not visible, not known. I'm betting that they're not. So I would go, I would put down at least 4-1, maybe 5-1, that if both of them did submit to that, the results would be in Biden's favor. I think a good picture of where Trump is now would be a scary one for the American people to contemplate. But to go back to the Supreme Court, I see them as serving Trump now that they can see that, which has been clear pretty much all along, that either Trump or Biden's going to be president, and the plutocracy would rather deal with Trump than with Biden. Uh, they probably think they can survive his craziness, and he's definitely willing to buy them things that they want. And they did okay when he was president before. The wealth gap between average Americans and the corporate system and the billionaire class widened because of the tax cut that Trump signed. But I don't think they're coming in to help Trump. I think that they're coming in because their masters, the force of the plutocracy, is interested in having power out of the hands of somebody like Biden, who might more equalize things or put obstacles in the way that they're transforming this democracy into a plutocracy, and they are also transforming this democracy into a fascist state. And Trump is their man for doing that for the next 4 years, and they're willing to gamble on him. That's my guess. They might prefer a better, saner Republican. I heard Jamie Raskin on television saying about the blocking of the bump stock regulation. Where they struck down uh, really a decision that was extremely offensive to anybody with any legal integrity. The regulation passed in the wake of that Las Vegas mass killing on bump stocks, which turned semi-automatics into machine guns, et cetera, et cetera. Jamie Raskin talked about that they were basically Republican operatives. So far, I agree. And that the Republican Party is the party of Donald Trump. And so basically, they're doing Trump's bidding. I don't think that that's the right way to understand it, actually. My understanding, at least, I think it's correct, but I wouldn't bet the farm. My understanding is that the Supreme Court is doing what it can to prevent the interest in public safety from eroding at all the Second Amendment right to bear arms as a sort of an absolute. And there's a reason for it that's political. It's not that they care about guns. What do guns have to do with what they're about? They're about amassing power and wealth for the people who are already the most powerful and the most wealthy. Events like Las Vegas and Uvalde and Parkland and Sandy Hook all those ugly things, they're really kind of irrelevant to what the plutocracy is interested in doing. Except what they want is for a lot of Americans to vote for the Republican Party, which is the agent of the plutocracy and now with a great admixture of fascism. The Ku Klux Klan knows who their guy is in this upcoming election. The Dobbs decision sort of reeks of the Spanish Inquisition. The Supreme Court, thinking better for Trump to not have to go through trial in order to safeguard the chances of a Republicans being in control in the upcoming election. Also, in the long-term plan, thinks it's important that they keep Americans completely embroiled in a conflict over gun rights, where they feed an absolutism that the NRA has been cultivating for decades that doesn't compromise to help protect the lives of innocent Americans from our serial disasters with guns. And it creates a one-issue voting bloc that the Republicans can count on. Now, I was a Democratic nominee for Congress here in the 6th District of Virginia, running for 2011, 2012 election. And I can tell you, there are a lot of voters who, if they can be kept scared about infringements on their absolute rights to have guns, so they don't have a gun show loophole closed, they don't have a ban on assault weapons, they don't have red flag laws, all the things that are sort of just obviously reasonable, so that we cease to have a homicide rate with guns that's like 17 times what they have in Germany or something like that. If they can keep all those people to be like the people that I came across as I campaigned across this district, who all they wanted to know is what's my position on guns. And if it wasn't absolutist like the NRA and like the Supreme Court, they weren't interested in knowing anything else about me. That's what I mean by one-issue voters. Abortion and guns, two issues that don't impact what the plutocracy cares about. And they put the Supreme Court together that we've got now. People that made it through the selection process, being groomed from way down in the hierarchy up to various levels, and satisfying the Federalist Society and the other people that, what's his name, Whitehouse from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse, has identified as their process. They own the court, and they're aligned with the fascist element, which has been fed for the last generation on the right. It's not Donald Trump's Republican Party. And so maybe it's politically wise to put the emphasis on when they do something stupid and destructive, unjustifiable, not stupid, like strike down the bump stock measure that had been passed in 2017. Maybe it's politically advantageous to say, well, they're serving Trump. I don't see how that particularly serves Trump. All the things that this Supreme Court has done about guns, I think is probably fundamentally unjustifiable. their Heller decision, which is back when was that, 2008 or something like that, they instituted a kind of right that ignores what I think is fairly clear in the history. They're so corrupt that they've got help from the corporatist class force. They've got help in fashioning phony history and phony precedent, which has been uncovered. It's really quite amazing. And the Republican Party, if they didn't have all those gun people all over rural America voting for them because they've been told guns are the foundation of their all their other liberties, and that everybody, all the folks on the other side are coming for their guns, and they will unman them. I mean, there's a lot of sick stuff going on around guns, and it all serves the Republican Party. And the cost of it is, well, two costs. One, at the level of guns, we keep on not being able to do anything to bring our gun death rate to be at least in the same ballpark as other decent societies that are free societies that where guns are regulated in a more sane way than ours. But that also it serves to keep a lot of decent people distracted. I mean, here we come back to human consciousness. If you can persuade enough people that everything that's important hinges on keeping guns from being regulated in any way, if you can tell them that, all your liberties depend on that, the American way of life depends on that, then they can say, well, I'm going to vote for that. And they're not going to necessarily pay attention to the complex world that we live in, where, a half an hour a week of actual news would show you that in terms of your actual interests and the quality of your life, the people you're voting for are really hurting and exploiting you. It's taught as a, what's the word, like an indication, a sign, a sufficient evidence. It's just a marker. A person's position on guns when fundamental liberties are at stake is enough to know you're voting for the right person. And here we get again into the kind of consciousness that people get socialized into having. I think that average human intelligence, which is capable of learning a language as difficult as English, when you're kids, and you can even learn a second language fairly well. Learning a language is no small thing. I think it's a lot harder than being able to draw obvious conclusions about who's actually screwing you when the evidence is abundant. But human consciousness is, again, it's this thing that can be shaped. We created civilization because we had the ratio of what can be shaped, like by a culture, and what is inborn, like instinctually. It's been changing over the millions of years as we emerged. We became more and more cultural, which means that we have more and more flexibility. And that's sort of a marvel. I mean, you can get a Shakespeare, you can get a Newton, you can get an Einstein, you can get a Bach, you can get a Michelangelo. I mean, there's all kinds of things that the human mind can become. That very plasticity seems to make us vulnerable to being exploited by forces of brokenness. So we've got a real problem. That force of brokenness has got a lot of beachheads in America right now. I never thought I'd see a Republican base or any group of tens of millions of Americans willing to embrace what they're embracing, support what they're supporting. I never thought I'd see a Supreme Court, and I've loved the Supreme Court. It's 60 years ago this year since I studied it as an undergraduate and fell in love with the whole field. I never thought I'd see a Supreme Court. I've been watching Andrew Weissman, who's one of my favorites these days. He's come around to being really pretty open about how seriously offensive this Supreme Court is. I'm not sure if he's gone into interpreting what it means that this court, how this court got to be that way. And there's also the question, what can we do about it? Because these are still lifetime appointments. But, people are talking about things that we can do about it. We've got a many front battle. I read earlier my Memorial Day thing about the people who saved democracy from fascism back in World War II. Churchill's UK was so seriously threatened, and FDR's America that was attacked by the fascist regime in Japan. We had to, as a nation, fight a multi-front war. I mean, there was the war in the South Pacific against the Japanese. There was a war in North Africa and Sicily and Italy, and then and then Normandy against the Nazi regime. It required a lot of components, manufacturing and training and deployment and strategies. And it was hard. I mean, even the development of the atomic bomb was a function of the incredible creativity and resources that America was able to focus on achieving what it felt like it maybe needed to achieve to prevail in that war. I'm not going to go into the question of, the use of it and the decisions and right and wrong. I've been interested in that since I was a teenager, but I'm not going to go there. But in any event, what this country was able to do in the face of this global threat was incredible. The numbers of tanks, planes, ships coming off the manufacturing lines, the incorporation of millions and millions of men and a fair number of women to play the roles that needed to be played in waging the war. The emergence of some great leaders, George Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur. I'm not going to begrudge him as having been a great leader at a couple of junctures before he decided he was God. It was quite a thing that our country did. Well, we've got a multi-front war to wage now, and I would love to think that the nation will be able to rouse itself to wage a campaign that's as historically creditable as the one that won World War II. We got to defeat Donald Trump in this election or who knows how much damage he might do as president. I mean, he's become so openly contemptuous of the fundamental things about the American system of government that he took an oath to defend and betrayed in many ways. We've got a problem with a political party that even before Trump arose had shown itself to be problematic, such that it had fashioned a Republican base that would choose this guy to be their standard bearer. I don't think that the Republicans of Reagan's era would have ever considered anything like Donald Trump. But between 1981 to 89, with Reagan as president, and the emergence of Trump into the 2015-16 campaign, there had been a transformation of the Republican base. The Republican base that elected Reagan was normal in a way that the Republican base that nominated Donald Trump was very different. So we got a lot of things going on there. The leader, the party, the base, and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's got a job to do it's magnificent in concept. Justice has been called the first virtue of social institutions. Justice. It means the alternative to the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, which is one way of talking about what the inevitable consequences of the rise of civilization was. The spirit of the gangster, the war of all against all. Justice. There will be conflicts in society, but we've got the rule of law. And the rule of law is set up, a magnificent piece of work of generations of people who cared about justice, who set up due process and say you can't torture, and all kinds of great things that were such an improvement over the way civilization first emerged as a domestic power system, with tyrants and slaves. Justice. And our founders set it up so that there would be a way in which the Supreme Court would be this institution where ultimately justice would have to be done. The Supreme Court doesn't give a damn about justice. It just blows the mind how fundamentally corrupt they are in all kinds of directions, not only taking these junkets, but like Alito describing himself as, not an arbiter who weighs the two sides. He says, to hell with the other side. There's no splitting the difference here. One side's got to win. This is not the way justice thinks. Everybody's got rights. Not just the people who agree with one side. But that's not how Alito thinks about it. Justice, like giving the most vulnerable people a vote, not stealing it away from them like this particular political party continually works to do. Well, this Supreme Court is occupied territory. And it's imperative that somehow or other it be recaptured. And that's a tough order. Because on the other hand, on one hand, if you want to uphold the rule of law, which the people who believe in America want to do, well, the rule of law says that what the Supreme Court says is the law of the land. There isn't an escape hatch built into the rule of law that says you can tell the Supreme Court to go enforce it themselves, like Andrew Jackson once said, or that they can go screw themselves, which I'm tempted to say. That's a violation of the rule of law, to defy the Supreme Court. But on the other hand, if the Supreme Court is siding with the criminal against the rule of law, how are you going to uphold the rule of law by treating the Supreme Court with the respect that the Constitution tells you you've got to do it? It's a dilemma. People have got proposals having to do with expanding the court and having a judicial ethics. I don't think judicial ethics go very far to solving the problem. You can have people who are completely corrupt, who are not necessarily taking bribes, or don't necessarily have a appearance of a conflict of interest. The way Justice Alito has with his wife having put up the flags, and like Thomas has with his wife having been conspiring with Meadows to overturn the election. Now that's a conflict of interest, but you can be plenty corrupt without having that kind of immediate dog in it. You're doing the bidding of the fascist and plutocratic force. That's corruption enough. So I hope we can move forward on it, but one of the things that we could use is really powerful voices being raised out in the country that inspire people. I mean, I really like Joe Biden, and I think he's done an excellent job. But I say all the time, I think he should have separated himself from Israel sooner when it became obvious they were going to disregard his advice. But other than that, I think he's actually done an excellent job as president, and I expect that as old as he is, which is 4 years older than I am, I expect that he'll do okay for another 4 years. But I've always liked oratory. Um, it's almost like a kind of music in terms of moving me. When a speaker can get up and speak in a way that inspires people. I've only heard a few speeches that were like that. FDR delivered he delivered a lot of such speeches. If FDR were president now, I feel a lot, somebody with his rhetorical abilities, I would feel a lot more secure. But, Biden's what we got, and he deserves all of our support because he's all we got to save American democracy, and he'll do what he can. And you can't expect anything more from him. He's not a great speaker. He's not as good as he used to be as a speaker. I don't know whether supporting cast can pick up where the guy with the bully pulpit left off. But you go to war with the army you got, and he's the guy with the bully pulpit, and we've got a lot of other people who care about the survival of American democracy, and they've got truth on their side. And I believe that they've got on their side that most Americans, if they understood the choice that we have, will choose the right choice, and that is to vote for Joe Biden. But I don't feel the confidence I'd like that the messaging will be all that it should. I got hopes, but I got worries too, because I've observed how difficult it has been for the liberal world and the good guys in general to fight the fight the way it needs to be fought. There's a power in words that can inspire people, and that's got to do. Inspire means in spirit. There is a spiritual dimension to this. It is necessary to find the ways of rhetoric that touch people. Like when you watch a Civil War movie and you see these Union soldiers marching along, and in the soundtrack you've got the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Mine eyes have seen the glory. And it's the glory of the coming of the Lord. I mean, it is a spiritual way of conceiving what they were doing. As he died to make men holy, let us live to make men free, or die to make men free. I forget it was a spiritual thing, and it is important when you're going to try to get victory in a war against evil that people get plugged into their love of the sacred and the good. Well, thank you for coming along with me. That's it. I'm not going to be, I will be here in a recorded form on Thursday. In the meanwhile, if you want to support me, and I feel very desirous of your support, follow, like, let's see, what else am I saying? Oh, go to my website, go to my collection of YouTube videos, which are in 3 digits now in number, and listen to the other stuff I've said. And in terms of my ultimate goal here, please see if what I'm putting forward as my better human story works for you as a perspective through which to see what our situation is as a species and what we are called to do.